They told everyone I washed out, that I quit, that I couldn't handle the pressure. Not everyone is cut out for the military, my mother once said at a dinner party, her voice laced with quiet shame. I wasn't there to hear it, but someone who loved me repeated it years later, like a warning. This is how your family tells your story. To them, I was the daughter who vanished after her second year at the academy. The dropout. The one who never wrote, never called, never stood in front of a flag for a photo like my cousins did. No promotion pins, no medals to pass around the table. They filled in the silence the only way they knew how, with failure. But it wasn't failure. It was duty. And duty for some of us came with silence, classified orders, disappearances explained only in vague terms, years without address, my name missing from records or buried under layers of access restrictions. Even my parents weren't allowed to know, especially not them. And maybe that was the hardest part, not the work, not the danger, but the erasure. Because when you serve in silence, your absence starts to say things you never meant. And the people who used to know you begin to rewrite you. So I let them. I let them tell the version that made sense to them. That I cracked. That I gave up. That Emily, the younger one, the golden one, was the real soldier in the family. Let her shine. Let her rise. Let her parents beam with pride as she pinned on rank after rank, made speeches, sent photos home from the field. Let them forget the other one, the quiet shadow who left and didn't return. Until one day, I did return. Not to explain myself, not to fight back, but to sit in a room I used to belong to and finally let them see what silence had hidden. Not a failure, not a dropout, but someone who had served just as fiercely, just without the applause. I used to be Alexandra Jennings. The name once meant something. Cadet first class, tactical prodigy, the girl who could dismantle and reassemble a field radio in under 2 minutes, the one who didn't just pass survival training but rewrote the expectations. I broke records, earned commendations, and wore my uniform like a second skin. My instructors said I had star potential. My family agreed for a while. Every Christmas, every 4th of July, every family reunion, I was the bright hope. My mother would beam and say, "Our Alexandra is going to be a colonel by 30, just you wait." My father printed my academy acceptance letter and framed it next to his high school football trophy. It felt good then, belonging to someone's pride, until I disappeared from it. The change came quietly. Second semester senior year. A plain man in an unmarked suit came to my dorm room. He didn't offer a badge, just a name I didn't recognize and a sealed envelope. We sat at a plain table in a basement I'd never noticed before. He said one sentence that changed my entire life. This assignment never existed. Then he slid the file toward me. No pressure, just a choice. We don't recruit just anyone, he said calmly. You have the kind of brain that can hold 10 chess games at once. The kind of discipline that follows instinct without hesitation, and no family ties that can't be redirected. I read the file in silence. It was thicker than any textbook I'd ever carried. Inside were operations I'd never heard of, counterintelligence efforts so far off-grid they didn't even leave footprints. If you accept this, your record will show you left the academy before graduation. There will be no phone calls, no letters home, no recognition. You will be invisible, but you'll save people who don't even know you exist. I signed. Not out of pride, not out of glory, but because it felt right. Quietly, completely right. I didn't graduate with my class. There was no ceremony, no photograph, just an empty seat with my name removed and a whispered rumor that Jennings had cracked under pressure. My parents never got the call they were expecting. My siblings didn't ask questions. The few friends I had assumed I'd flunked out, and I didn't correct them, I couldn't. Instead, I boarded a plane in the middle of the night, destination redacted, and began a life that lived in the margins. For the next 22 years, I operated under names that weren't mine. I wore a dozen languages like jackets, changed hair colors in mirrors that didn't reflect the same face for long. I learned to breathe beneath water, beneath pressure, beneath secrets. My work took me everywhere and nowhere. Middle Eastern capitals, Balkan borders, Arctic bases, no one talks about. I extracted targets from collapsing regimes, passed encrypted data in marketplaces disguised as a tourist, slept in safe houses that vanished 3 days after I left them. Every mission I completed, someone lived who might have died. A government crisis was quietly avoided, a war diffused before it reached the news cycle. But I never got a medal, because I never officially existed. Meanwhile, life went on back home. I received one-way updates through redacted channels, or the occasional holiday letter forwarded by a family liaison who pretended not to know. My sister got married. My brother opened a hardware store. My mother had surgery on her hip. They sent photos I wasn't in, cards addressed to Alex, who used to be in the military. I think no one asked what really happened. No one came looking. And I didn't blame them. In their minds, I had fallen off the track. To be honest, I think they preferred that version. The burnout story made more sense than a daughter swallowed by shadows. Keg. Sometimes in quiet moments, usually after a mission when I sat alone in a hotel room, with the minibar unopened and the city humming far below, I would wonder if I should have chosen differently. Wondered what it would have been like to be someone whose victories were clapped for. Someone who wore her last name across her chest with pride and saw it echoed in the eyes of her family. But then I'd remember the people I saved, the warlords I helped bring down, the children I saw ushered onto planes alive because I'd been there. And I knew this was the life I chose. This was the life I built. Still, it's strange how silence rewrites you. You don't just disappear from paperwork, you disappear from memory. By year 10, I was the cousin no one mentioned. By year 15, my name had been removed from the family group chat. At first, it hurt. Not deeply, just in small, quiet cuts. But eventually, even that faded. You learn to live in a life where no one misses you. You make peace with being the blank spot in their scrapbook. You stop needing to be remembered, and instead, you remember yourself. I don't know what I expected when I finally came back. Maybe nothing. Maybe a seat in the back of the room at some retirement party. But that story, my story, wasn't over yet. Because the thing about truth is, it doesn't vanish. It just waits, quietly, until the moment you stop apologizing for surviving the way you had to, and start living, seen. The invitation came on heavy cardstock, the kind that insists you pay attention. Embossed in gold, elegant in its formality. Retirement ceremony, General Adam Carver, Joint Command. It arrived without fanfare. No phone call, no handwritten note, just a name on a list. I stared at the envelope a long time before opening it. Not because I wasn't going, but because something about it felt final. And maybe that's what made it matter. Carver had been one of the few who knew me both by name and by function. He had vouched for me once years ago when things got messy with a State Department assignment. We hadn't spoken in a while, but he knew what this would mean. On the final page of the program, tucked under formal bios and dignitaries, was a small line of text: guest of honor, Lieutenant General A.J. Cassadine. No one in my family would recognize the name. Cassadine wasn't the name they'd given me at birth. It was the one I'd earned under fire. The one spoken in hushed tones across bases and war rooms. The one I signed on mission briefings that never saw the light of day. The world had known me as Cassadine longer than anyone had known me as Alexandra. So when I walked into the hall that evening, dressed in my formal service blues, there was no fanfare, no spotlight, just silence. 3 stars gleamed on each shoulder. I moved like a ghost through familiar terrain, flashes of memory embedded in walls and faces, a quiet knowledge of who had stood where and when. Some officers nodded, a few snapped to attention. Most glanced quickly at my rank and offered a crisp salute. I returned each one with quiet acknowledgement. No one asked where I had been, because the kind of stars I wore didn't come from speeches or parade fields. They came from silence, from duty kept, from lives preserved in the shadows. The event hall was bright white tablecloths, small flags at every seat, champagne flutes waiting patiently for celebration. I recognized almost no one, but I knew this crowd. Decorated men and women, distinguished guests, high command and their spouses, people who had built careers in daylight while I operated in the margins. Still, the room shifted when I entered. Not dramatically, just enough. A ripple of awareness, a rearranging of presence. I walked toward the front, not to the center table, but to the one just behind it. Reserved, subtle, a place of proximity without pageantry. It was then I saw them. My mother and father. Their names had been on the guest list too. As former military parents, they still carried some ceremonial currency. Enough to earn them a seat at the front. Enough to be seen. They hadn't seen me yet. I watched them from a distance, quiet behind my glass of water. My mother was talking to another officer's wife, her hands moving in small, polite circles. My father sat stiffly watching the room like a man still trying to read the terrain. Then she turned and her eyes met mine. For a moment, nothing happened. Her glass tilted just enough for the champagne to touch the edge, threatening to spill. She caught it reflexively, blinking hard like her mind was still catching up with her eyes. She stared at the uniform, the insignia, the stars. "Alex," she said quietly, but loud enough for those around her to hear. I walked closer, steady and measured. "Why are they saluting you?" I smiled softly. Nothing performative, no vengeance, just a truth that no longer needed hiding. Because I outrank them. She didn't respond, not with words. She just looked at me, really looked. Not the daughter she remembered failing, not the used-to-be in family stories, but someone else entirely. Someone she had never met, and still, someone she had always loved. My father stood slowly. His face had gone pale. I could see the confusion behind his eyes. He wanted to ask what this meant, where I had been, why no one told them, why I hadn't told them. But instead of questions, he offered something else, something rare, a hand. I took it. We didn't speak, not yet. But that gesture, silent, steady, was enough. Later that evening, during the formal toasts, General Carver took the stage. He listed achievements, introduced high-ranking guests, thanked his family. Then his voice changed. "We have among us tonight someone who doesn't need applause," he said. "Someone whose service can't be captured in bullet points or medals." He looked directly at me. "I want to personally acknowledge Lieutenant General A.J. Cassadine for her years of uncredited leadership, for the lives saved in silence, and for a legacy that outlasts titles." There was no standing ovation, no trumpet, no anthem, just a room full of people turning slowly to see me. For the first time, they didn't look away. Hate. After the ceremony, people approached, some with gratitude, some with quiet reverence, others just nodded, no questions, just respect. But the most surprising moment came not from the military elite, but from my niece. She was in college now, home for the summer. She stood awkwardly beside my mother, uncertain. "Aunt Alex," she asked. "Is it true?" I turned toward her gently. "That you're a general," she whispered. I smiled. 4-star technically, but yes. She blinked wide-eyed. Then, "That's kind of amazing." Her voice held no judgment, no expectations, just awe. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. And for the first time in decades, I didn't feel like the ghost in the room. I was there, seen, standing, and quietly, finally, home. I hadn't planned to stay long. The ceremony had been enough. I'd shown up, let the past see me, let the silence speak louder than any apology. My return wasn't meant to stretch beyond that one evening. My name was now known, my uniform recognized. The chapter felt closed. But then 2 days later, my phone rang. Not my personal phone, the secure device I kept hidden, powered off deep in a coded lockbox. One I hadn't touched in over a year. The kind of phone you never ignore when it lights up. "Incoming call, Orbit 9. I answered. A familiar voice, low and clipped. "General Cassadine. We have a problem." I sat down slowly, my eyes already narrowing. "Breach, possibly. A near-silent flag hit one of our surveillance networks in Northern Europe. Someone scraping metadata from Operation Tanglewood. My stomach turned. Tanglewood had been my final classified op before I stood down. High-level extraction, foreign intel, 4 allies protected, 2 governments rerouted. The kind of mission that rewrote maps in invisible ink. I signed a lifetime NDA on that file, I said carefully. Who's poking at it? Civilian contractor in Virginia. Defense adjacent. Has some credentials, but not enough for that level. We think he's getting help. I closed my eyes. Name? A pause. Then Marcus J. Hensley. Former associate on a logistics panel. Connected to a family name, Jennings. It hit like a dull strike to the ribs. Marcus, my cousin. The one who always seemed to know people. Who bragged at family reunions about being almost cleared. Who once told my mother over pie that government work isn't that hard, you just have to learn the loopholes. I hadn't thought of him in years. But now he was the breach. You don't really retire from intelligence. You step out of the corridor, but you never quite let go of the key. You sleep, but only lightly. You smile, but one eye stays watchful. I knew what I had to do. But that didn't make it any easier. That night I went down into my basement, past the wooden stairs, through the second lock, into the room even my cleaning service didn't know existed. There was a vault there, reinforced titanium, biometric entry, a remnant of a life that never left me. Inside, decades of silence, reports, tapes, shadow files, all sealed, layered in countermeasures, and one manila envelope labeled only Tanglewood. I hadn't opened it in years, but I remembered every word. The next morning, I reached out to the one person I trusted on the civilian side. Carver's former chief of staff, now a quiet advisor at a DC think tank. He met me at a small cafe in Foggy Bottom. Neutral ground, Marcus Hensley, I said, sliding the photo across. He frowned. I know the name. Defense conferences. He talks like he's more important than he is. He's attempting to breach a black file, I said. Mine. His face changed instantly. Does he know who you are? No, I said. But he knows my maiden name. And that's apparently close enough. Hawaii. The next step was personal. I called Marcus directly. He answered with the smirk I could hear through the line. Alex? Wow, it's been a while. You're using the Jennings name to access confidential defense files, I said flatly. You've triggered a federal surveillance warning. You need to stop. A pause, then laughter. I'm not doing anything illegal, cousin. I'm just navigating opportunities. This isn't a game, Marcus. You're opening doors that were welded shut for a reason. People could die. You did fine with it, he said mockingly. Why shouldn't I? Because you didn't earn this. Because you don't understand the weight of it. Because real service doesn't come with shortcuts. I didn't say any of that. I just hung up. The next 48 hours were a blur of secure calls and briefings. The leak was stopped just in time. Marcus was issued a warning from the Office of Counterintelligence. One step further, and it wouldn't have been a phone call. It would have been an arrest. The information he'd attempted to access was revaulted this time with layers even I couldn't reopen. My operative name was quietly rotated again, another erasure, another birth. It was over. But the damage wasn't only bureaucratic. That weekend, my mother texted, "Saw Marcus today. He seemed upset, said you embarrassed him in front of people. Did you two have an argument?" I stared at the message for a long time. How could I explain that I'd spent my entire adult life keeping the world safe from men who thought access was power? That Marcus had come dangerously close to undoing something bigger than any of us? That I wasn't trying to embarrass him. I was trying to protect him from himself. But some things can't be explained in texts. Some truths are too complicated to translate. That night I sat in my living room. The house was quiet. No mission, no shadow OP, just me breathing in the aftermath. I looked at the fire burning low in the hearth. My file on the side table, my phone silent. For years I'd dreamed of resting, of not being the one who always had to be ready. And yet even now I knew. Some of us don't get to rest fully. Not because we're heroes, but because the world still spins. Because we're willing to carry what others ignore. They thought I was retired. But the world still whispered. And some truths, especially the dangerous ones, still had my name etched in their silence. And so I stayed. Not loud, not obvious, not needing thanks. Just ready. Because the price of peace isn't noise, it's vigilance. It was a quiet cafe on the edge of town, the kind with chipped mugs and old jazz playing low from a speaker that didn't always work. The kind of place people went to forget the world existed. That's why I chose it. Marcus came in late, still wearing that smug confidence he always wore like cologne, loud, overbearing, and impossible to ignore. He didn't recognize me at first. To him, I was still the dropout cousin, the one who'd ghosted the family after the academy, the girl he'd once teased for not making the cut. He looked at me in uniform now, decorated, pressed, and still, and squinted like he was staring at something impossible. "Alex," he said, half laughing, "you look different." "I am," I replied, calm. "Sit down." He slid into the booth across from me, still chuckling like it was a joke, like he was doing me a favor. "So, what's this about some family thing, Emily's promotion, maybe? You know, I've been working with a few people close to defense, classified logistics, that kind of thing." He said it the way people say borrowed power, as if standing near importance made him important too. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened the leather portfolio I'd brought. Quietly. Without ceremony. Inside one file. Stamped with multiple clearances. Pages redacted except where they didn't need to be. A printed photograph paperclipped to the corner. It showed Marcus. Smiling. Shaking hands with a man already indicted for misappropriation of defense funds. Behind them, a shipping manifest that was never supposed to exist. His face changed before the file even touched the table. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice tightening. "I didn't get it," I said evenly. "I authorized its release." He blinked. "Wait, you were the one behind—" "Yes." He reached for the file. I slid it away. "You don't get to touch this. Not anymore." There was a moment, just one, when the arrogance cracked. When the smirk fell and I saw the boy behind it. The boy who had always measured himself by who he could impress. He looked up at me like I'd become a stranger. Or maybe like I'd always been one, and he was only now seeing clearly. "Why now?" he asked. "Why come after me?" I exhaled slowly. "Because you've been using a system meant to protect lives to feed your ambition. Because you put real people at risk. Because it's time someone told you no." He opened his mouth like he had something rehearsed. I raised a hand. "No explanations," I said. "No excuses." The truth was, I wasn't angry. Not in the way he expected. I wasn't here to punish him. I was here to draw a line. I reached into my bag, pulled out a secure envelope, and slid the file into it. Sealed it with a simple strip of black tape. Then placed it gently on the table between us. "You'll be contacted by federal counsel within the next 48 hours. They'll want a statement." He stared at it like it might burn through the table. "And what if I don't cooperate?" he asked low. I stood, buttoned my coat, looked him in the eye. "Then the next time we meet, it won't be over coffee." He flinched. Just a little. I didn't need to threaten him. The truth was more powerful than that. And in truth, I wasn't just reclaiming my voice, I was reclaiming every moment I'd once been silenced by men like him. Men who inherited rooms they never earned. Men who assumed authority, while women like me had to work in the dark to earn respect we couldn't even speak of. As I turned to leave, I paused. Just long enough to say the words that had waited years to be said. "This time, Marcus, you answer to me." I didn't look back. Outside, the air was sharp and clean. Not triumphant, not victorious, just clear. Like something had been set right, not for revenge, but for restoration. I wasn't proud of what I'd done, but I was proud that I'd done it quietly, without spectacle, without fury, because sometimes the most powerful confrontation isn't loud. It's measured, calm, grounded in truth. It's standing in the place where you were once dismissed and not needing to prove anything anymore. Just letting the silence do what it does best, reveal what was always there. The night of the military gala was sharp with winter light, moon-hung high stars blinking like old memories. Outside the venue, rows of cars lined the snowy curb. Inside, everything gleamed. Polished boots, medals, crystal glasses clinking softly over low orchestral music. It was tradition, wrapped in ceremony, stitched with decades of reverence. I arrived late on purpose. Not to make an entrance, but to avoid the small talk that always felt too wide and too shallow. The full dress uniform fitted my second skin, dark navy pressed to perfection. The fourth star, newly embroidered, rested peacefully on my shoulder. I had stood in front of the president just 36 hours earlier for the pinning ceremony, quiet, discreet, no press. Just a private commendation for nearly 2 decades of work that would never make it to headlines. I had no intention of drawing attention tonight. It wasn't my gala. But attention, as I'd learned, sometimes arrives the moment you stop chasing it. I'd barely stepped into the ballroom when the first ripple moved through the crowd. It was Emily who noticed first. She was near the back table, flute of champagne in hand, chatting with cousins and old classmates from Fort Carson. The same Emily who once posted on Facebook, back when we still used Facebook, that her dropout aunt couldn't handle the heat. She turned her head, eyes catching the bars on my shoulder. She blinked and then blinked again, champagne frozen at her lips. That's when he approached. A tall officer in dress blues, posture straight as a post. He walked directly toward me, no hesitation. He stopped, saluted cleanly, and said loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Ma'am. Is it true you're General Cassadine?" My real name, my classified title, spoken out loud. I paused, then nodded once. A hush fell around us, the kind that isn't awkward, just heavy with recognition. Behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of glass slipping from Emily's hand. Her champagne hit the floor with a soft crack. My father, who had been silent most of the night, hovering near the punch table, turned slowly. His eyes landed not on my face, but on the insignia embroidered against my sleeve. I hadn't seen him look at me that way since I was 15, the year I brought home my first scholarship medal, the one he pinned to a bulletin board, then never mentioned again. For a heartbeat, no one moved. And then they stood, not with confusion, not with politeness, but with a kind of reverence I had never felt from them before. Emily stepped forward, still stunned. You never told us." I looked at her gently. "Would you have listened if I had?" She didn't answer, but she didn't deny it either. It wasn't shame I saw in her expression now. It was something quieter, recognition, realignment, as if the whole framework of what she thought she knew had just tilted, and she was willing to let it. The rest of the evening passed like a slow breath. Some approached me with questions, others with awe. My cousins offered to refill my drink. An old family friend said, "You always had something in you, just didn't know what." I didn't feel smug. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt whole. Because for once the narrative wasn't being filled in for me. I was in the room, not as a guest, not as an afterthought, but as the truth that had finally stepped into the light. Later, as coats were gathered and tables cleared, my father found me near the window. The stars were still out, still quiet. He stood beside me, hands in his pockets. "I should have asked more questions," he said softly. I didn't speak. I should have trusted that what I didn't understand wasn't failure, just hidden. I turned to him, watched the way his shoulders had sunk just slightly, like he'd been carrying something heavy and only now realized it. "It's okay," I said. "We all tell ourselves the easiest story." He nodded. But tonight I saw the real one. As I left the hall, people were still gathered in small groups, laughing, taking photos, finishing drinks. But something had shifted. They didn't ask where I'd been anymore. They didn't need to. They had seen me, not for who they imagined, not for who I used to be, but for who I had become in the years I was missing from their narrative. That night, I didn't disappear into the background. That night, they stood when I entered the room. and for the first time in my life, I didn't wonder if I belonged. The gala ended, but I didn't board the red-eye back to Washington like I normally would have. For the first time in years, I stayed. The house hadn't changed much, still smelled faintly of lemon polish and coffee grounds. The hallway lights flickered the same way they had when I was a teenager, always promising to be fixed, always forgotten. The hum of the heater, the creak of the third step, the way the morning sun warmed the edge of the stairwell, it was all familiar, all unchanged. But something was different. For the first time, my presence didn't feel like a disruption. On the hallway wall, the one lined with framed proof of the Cooper family's greatness, there was a new photo. It was me, shaking hands with the Secretary of Defense. The caption beneath was small but honest: General Alexandra Cassadine, Distinguished Service Commendation. It didn't scream, it didn't boast, it simply told the truth. I caught myself staring at it as I passed over and over, as if trying to confirm it wasn't a dream, that I had at last been allowed a place in the timeline. That afternoon, I unpacked a second bag in my old room. The trophies were still there. A few lacrosse medals, a faded banner from the Air Force Academy. A drawer I hadn't opened in a decade still held a crumpled letter I'd never mailed, meant for my mother, never sent. I didn't expect her to come upstairs. She never had before, not without calling first or asking someone else to send me down for dinner. But that morning, just after sunrise, I heard her knock. Soft, almost unsure. I opened the door. She stood there in her robe, hair loosely pinned up, hands clasped tightly in front of her. I didn't know she said. Her voice cracked at the edges. "I wasn't allowed to tell you." She nodded. Her eyes were wet. "But you..." She paused, searching the shape of me, as if still relearning what she saw. "You're a general." I smiled faintly. 4 stars. Her breath caught, and then without another word, she stepped forward and reached for my hand. She didn't ask questions. She didn't try to fill the silence. She simply stayed. We sat on the edge of my old bed. She held my hand like she used to when I was sick as a child, thumb brushing gently against my knuckles. There was no lecture, no guilt, just presence, just warmth. "I thought I failed you," she finally whispered. "When you left the academy, I thought I had done something wrong, that I pushed too hard." "You didn't," I said softly. "You were just proud of the version you could see." Her mouth trembled. "And I couldn't see this one." "It wasn't yours to see," I said. "Not then." She looked at me for a long time. "Did you ever feel alone?" I nodded. "Yes. But not unloved." That part mattered, more than I expected. She leaned her head on my shoulder just slightly. Her body was smaller than I remembered, her hands older. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. Not loud, not performative, just real. In the days that followed, we moved carefully around one another, but not uncomfortably, like two people relearning a rhythm they hadn't danced to in years. She made pancakes one morning and left a cup of coffee by my door without knocking. I folded laundry for her without being asked. We cooked together, her handing me spices, without needing to speak, me stirring soup, while she told me about the neighbor's new puppy. We didn't talk much about the past. We didn't need to. Sometimes healing comes not in explanation, but in witnessing. And that's what we were finally doing, witnessing each other, without expectations, without rewriting the story to make it prettier or easier. One evening, as the house settled into quiet, I walked the hall again, looked at the photo on the wall, Emily's awards, Nathan's diplomas, my commendation, different paths, different honors. But now, none erased the others. For the first time, our stories existed side by side, and that to me felt like peace. It was a Tuesday, quiet, unremarkable, the kind of day that comes and goes without asking anything of you. Outside my window, Denver blinked gently, glass buildings catching the late sun traffic humming without urgency. I stood in my study, a leather-bound box open on the table in front of me. It used to be kept in a secure facility, Reinforced steel vault, thumbprint and passcode protected. For 18 years it stayed hidden behind walls no one could name just like me. Inside old field reports, lists of names that had been protected. Operations buried so deep in black ink they barely existed on paper. Grainy photos from regions no one publicly acknowledged. My world once, my silence always. I'd brought the box home months ago after my final reassignment. The agency had offered to archive it on record. I told them no, not out of fear, not out of pride, but because some stories don't belong in archives. They belong in hands, in the lives they touched, in the quiet courage they left behind. Now the box sat open, not because I wanted to explain it, but because for the first time, I didn't have to hide it anymore. There were no framed medals on my walls, no social media tributes, no memoir in the works, just the rhythm of ordinary days, tea in the morning, long walks at dusk, jazz playing softly in the kitchen. I didn't feel the need to defend who I had been, or prove who I had become. I just lived. It was that simple, and that sacred. Sometimes Emily would call from base, her voice tired but warm. "You'd be proud of what we're doing this month," she'd say, then hesitate. "I know I was proud of you. I just didn't know how to show it." I'd smile. "You're showing it now." Other times I'd get short texts from my father. "Heard your team's method got implemented at DoD. Nice work." Then another one days later. "Sunday dinner. Bring that soup you make." And that was enough. No grand gestures, no long overdue apologies wrapped in tears, just presence, respect. Familiarity finally made whole. That afternoon I sat down at my desk and ran my hand over the edge of the file box. The leather had softened over time, worn lived-in honest. Like me. The doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, a young cadet stood there, barely in his 20s, haircut. Sharp eyes bright with the kind of idealism I once had to learn to temper. He shifted nervously. "Ma'am, are you—" I waited. He cleared his throat, almost embarrassed. "Are you General Cassadine?" I nodded. He straightened instantly, heels together. I'm in intel school. Your name came up in a case study. What you did in the Basra corridor." He stopped himself. "Sorry, I wanted to say thank you. They told us what you did saved lives." Quietly, without ever getting noticed. I stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come in," I said. He hesitated, surprised. "You don't have to say much," I added. "But you should know what quiet leadership looks like. It's not always in the spotlight." He followed me in. His eyes scanned the room not for trophies, but for something to anchor the myth he had heard. There were none, just books, a pot of tea, the sound of wind brushing the window. I walked over to the leather box and rested a hand on the lid. "Most of what you've read you'll never be able to repeat," I told him. "Yes, ma'am," he said quickly. "But you'll carry it," I continued. "The knowing, that's enough." He nodded again. Eyes a little wider now, less starry, more grounded. And in that moment, I didn't see a cadet. I saw a torch being passed. After he left, I stood alone again. No applause, no headlines, just the quiet, steady pulse of belonging. The kind that doesn't fade when the guests go home. The kind that isn't borrowed from medals or moments, but forged slowly in silence over years of showing up when no one asked you to. I didn't shut the file box. I left it open its edges, brushing the breeze from the cracked window. Let the truth breathe. Let the legacy live, not in monuments, but in memory, in quiet courage passed from one set of steady hands to another. Because some of us don't need to be the brightest in the room. We just need to be seen. And now I am.